What if the biggest obstacle to actually getting things done is just this persistent underlying belief that you're, supposed to feel good while doing them?
Yeah, that's a really massive trap.
Right. Well, welcome in everyone to today's deep dive. We are tackling a fascinating dilemma today that I think virtually every dedicated learner
Oh,
faces.
absolutely.
Whether you are, prepping for some high-stakes meeting, or you're trying to catch up on a rapidly changing industry, or maybe you're just trying to satisfy your own intense curiosity.
Yeah.
You have a goal,
hmm
but between you and that goal is this massive wall of friction. So to figure out how to dismantle that friction, we're exploring a highly distilled, intensely focused set of excerpts from a work titled The Architecture of Action: Discipline Over Motivation.
And it's a really remarkable piece of text, actually, mostly because of what it refusing to do.
Right, it doesn't really give you the usual fluff.
No, not at all. It doesn't offer this sprawling multi-step productivity system. It completely ignores all that typical self-help advice about, finding your passion or visualizing success.
Thank goodness.
Right. Instead, the source material just cuts straight to a single, pivotal showdown regarding human behavior.
Yeah.
It basically argues that our inability to execute consistently is not a failure of character. It's actually a structural failure in how we approach action itself.
Which is such a fascinating way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it sets up this structural failure by presenting us with this incredibly stark concept, right? Discipline versus motivation.
Exactly.
But before we can really analyze that specific showdown,
Yeah.
I feel like we have to look at the environment where this battle takes place.
Yes, the framework is crucial.
Because the source doesn't just casually throw these words around.
Mhm.
It operates within a very specific framework, which is, right there in the title, the architecture of action.
Mhm.
We aren't talking about the habit of action or the psychology of action.
Mhm.
The source intentionally uses the word architecture.
And that specific word choice changes the entire paradigm of how we view progress.
How so?
Well, when we look at standard goal setting, people tend to treat action as this sequence of isolated events. So you wake up, you decide if you're going to work out, you sit at your desk, you decide if you're going to read that dense industry report.
Right, you're constantly making choices.
Exactly. And each of those moments requires a massive spike in activation energy because you are essentially building a new intention from scratch every single time.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And the source points out that this is profoundly inefficient.
Because it requires you to constantly negotiate with yourself, right?
Yes.
It's just a massive drain on your cognitive load.
Yeah.
You're burning energy just deciding whether or not to even start.
Precisely. You're experiencing acute decision fatigue before the actual work has even begun. And so this is where the concept of architecture becomes vital.
Okay, unpack that word for us. Architecture.
So architecture implies a framework that is intentionally designed, right? It's meticulously constructed step by step, and it's built specifically to withstand external pressures.
It's solid.
Right. An architectural structure is permanent. It is load-bearing.
Okay.
Once a building is erected, the steel beams and the concrete foundations, they don't have to wake up every morning and decide if they feel like holding up the roof today.
That's a great image.
Their structural integrity simply dictates that the roof stays up. And the source is arguing that human action must be designed the exact same way.
So you have to construct a behavioral environment that facilitates the work automatically, regardless of the occasion or the mood.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy for you listening.
Yeah.
If we look at action as a physical building, motivation might be like the flashy ribbon-cutting ceremony,
Oh, I like that.
right? It's flashy, it's exciting, everyone is cheering. But the architecture is the foundation that's buried deep in the dirt. It's the load-bearing column that isn't glamorous at all, but it's the only reason the entire project doesn't just collapse under its own weight when the real pressure hits.
That is the exact mechanical distinction the text makes. You are shifting the burden of execution from your temporary emotional state over to a permanent structural system.
Okay, but wait. Let me push back on this for a second.
Sure.
If I'm the architect, don't I need that initial spark of motivation to even bother drafting the blueprints in the first place? I mean, doesn't an architect need to feel inspired to design the building?
That's a very fair point, and it's a common pushback. The text doesn't deny that a spark might initiate the design phase.
Okay.
But the critical difference is sustainability. A spark can start a fire, but a spark cannot hold up a roof.
Right.
A building is sustained by its physical structure, the architecture itself. You bypass the emotional processing center that constantly asks, do I feel like doing this? The system has already answered the question for you.
But if I'm the one who has to build this massive, permanent behavioral structure, doesn't that require just a tremendous amount of brute force?
What do you mean?
Well, if I'm forcing myself to read dense technical papers every single day when I'm just absolutely miserable and exhausted, doesn't discipline eventually just become a synonym for a prison? I
This.
mean, doesn't a rigid architecture just accelerate burnout?
That is a crucial challenge to the text. And it touches on a very common misunderstanding.
Okay.
The source actually addresses this by separating the concept of architecture from the concept of brute force willpower.
Wait, they aren't the same thing.
Not at all. Willpower is what causes burnout. Willpower is when you have no structure, you feel terrible, and you attempt to force an action anyway through sheer mental strain.
Oh, wow.
It's an emotional exertion. Architecture, on the other hand, is the absence of exertion.
How does that work in practice, though? If I really don't want to do the work, there has to be some friction.
Right. There is friction initially, yes, during the construction phase. But the purpose of the architecture is habituation.
Habituation.
Right. By adhering to a strict structural discipline, meaning doing the exact same action in the exact same environment at the exact same time, you dramatically lower the activation energy required.
So it gets easier.
Exactly. Think of it like laying down a track for a train. Digging the dirt and laying the steel track is hard, unglamorous work.
Right.
That is the initial discipline. But once the track is laid, once that architecture is there, the train of action can just roll forward smoothly.
Oh, I see.
You do not have to carry the train on your back every single day using brute force willpower. The structure carries the weight. Burnout happens when you try to carry the train without a track.
Okay, that clarifies the mechanics significantly. The architecture lowers the activation energy over time, so the action actually becomes sustainable.
Exactly.
But that brings us directly to the core conflict the source sets up.
Right, the showdown.
Yeah. If we need this permanent structure to sustain action, how does motivation fit into the picture? Because the text explicitly frames this as a battle. Discipline versus motivation.
Yes.
Why are these two concepts positioned as completely incompatible adversaries?
Well, it's because keeping them both in the same behavioral ecosystem actively sabotages the architecture.
Really? Sabotages it.
Absolutely. Let's look at the mechanical nature of motivation for a second. As you know, motivation is inherently tied to fluctuating neurochemical responses.
Right, it's basically emotional weather.
Exactly. It's a reaction to stimuli. So if you sleep well, or if the project is new and exciting, or if someone praises your initial ideas, your motivation spikes.
Sure.
But the moment the work gets tedious, or you hit a complex problem, or, you just didn't sleep well, that motivation evaporates.
Yeah, everyone listening to this deep dive already knows that motivation is totally fickle.
Right, but the source takes it a step further than just saying it's unreliable.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. If the text literally pits them against each other, does that imply that motivation isn't just a weak tool, but might actually become a detriment once the architecture is built?
Yes, that is exactly the argument. The source argues that relying on motivation creates a behavioral dependency that prevents the architecture from ever truly forming.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. If you condition your brain to believe that an action should only occur when preceded by the neurochemical hit of motivation, that feeling of being ready or inspired.
You establish a bottleneck.
Exactly. You are effectively teaching your system that the absence of motivation is a legitimate structural excuse for inaction.
So by trying to manufacture motivation, I'm actually reinforcing my inability to act without it.
Yes.
Like if I watch a 20-minute productivity video on YouTube just to hype myself up to write a report, I am not building discipline. I'm just feeding a dependency.
You are feeding a dependency, and you're building a skyscraper out of materials that dissolve in the rain.
Man, that's rough.
The verses in the text is a warning about structural incompatibility. You cannot build a load-bearing wall out of fluctuating emotional states.
It just won't hold up.
No. If you invite motivation to be the, let's say, project manager of your long-term goals, it will constantly call in sick whenever the conditions are less than perfect, and the work will simply halt.
Which means motivation has to be completely removed from the managerial role if the architecture is going to survive.
It has to be fired. The system must operate on a binary code.
Binary code.
Right. The alarm goes off. You get up, or you do not. The schedule says to write. You write or you do not.
There's no middle ground.
None. The internal feeling of wanting to do the task becomes entirely irrelevant to the mechanical execution of the task.
I mean, that is a stark way to live. But I can see how it completely eliminates the decision fatigue we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Because if my feelings are irrelevant, I don't have to spend 30 minutes negotiating with myself over a cup of coffee. The blueprint just dictates the next brick.
And that elimination of negotiation is exactly why the text moves from pointing out the conflict to prescribing a definitive solution.
Which is the subtitle of the source material.
Right. Discipline over motivation.
It's not just discipline instead of motivation, it's over, which implies a very specific operational hierarchy.
It is an active ranking system. Think of any complex system, whether it's computer software or human behavior. When two conflicting commands are entered simultaneously, the system relies on a pre-programmed hierarchy to determine which protocol to execute.
Okay, I'm following.
So your brain generates a command based on motivation. I am tired. I do not feel like reading this data. Let's stop.
We've all been there.
Right. But simultaneously, your architectural protocol generates a command. It is 8:00 a.m. The schedule dictates we read the data. Let's go.
So they clash.
They clash. The word over means you must consciously pre-program your operating system to ensure the discipline protocol permanently supersedes the motivation command.
The hierarchy dictates the execution. When motivation says wait, discipline just overrides it with execute.
Precisely. It is a daily, intensely practical application where you actively subjugate a fleeting feeling to a permanent structure.
So it doesn't mean you never feel motivated again.
No, not at all. The source doesn't argue that motivation ceases to exist or that you won't occasionally feel a surge of inspiration. That's fine when it happens.
That's just a bonus.
Right. It simply dictates that motivation can never hold a rank higher than discipline in your behavioral chain of command.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Let's translate this hierarchy from an abstract psychological concept into a mechanical reality.
Let's do it.
Say you are stepping into a highly technical role. You have this intimidating stack of dense industry research that you absolutely have to master to stay relevant. But it is dry, it's complex, and it is overwhelmingly tedious.
This is the perfect stress test for the framework because it's a high-stakes goal with extremely high friction.
Right. Now, if your internal hierarchy places motivation over discipline, what happens? You look at that stack of research, and the friction is immediate. The activation energy required to parse that data is massive.
It's huge.
And because your system requires the feeling of readiness to act, you wait.
You delay.
Yeah. You might try to hack the system. You organize your desk. You check your emails just to feel productive. You wait for the, quote, right time to dive in.
But you're really just burning cognitive energy trying to manufacture the desire to read.
Exactly. And by mid-afternoon, you are exhausted by the underlying anxiety of this uncompleted task, and the stack remains completely untouched.
The structural failure occurs because the system encountered resistance, and the highest ranking protocol, which in this case was motivation, chose to retreat.
Wow. But if we apply the source's exact hierarchy, discipline over motivation, the mechanics completely shift.
Yes, they do.
You design the architecture first. The blueprint says, I will read exactly 5 pages of this research every single morning at 7 a.m., sitting at this specific desk, regardless of any internal state. That is the load-bearing structure.
And the execution of that structure is where the over is realized.
Exactly. You sit down at 7 a.m., you feel the exact same friction as before, you're tired, the material is dense, and your motivation is absolutely zero.
Your emotional protocol is practically screaming at you to stop.
Yes. But because discipline is ranked over motivation, the emotional protocol is just ignored. You read the 5 pages.
And what is critical to understand here is what happens neurologically and behaviorally during that exact moment.
Break that down for us.
When you read those 5 pages while feeling completely uninspired, you are not just making incremental progress on the research, you are actively reinforcing the structural integrity of the architecture.
You're proving it to yourself.
Yes. You are proving to your own cognitive system that action can occur independently of emotion.
Oh man, You are teaching your brain that the weather doesn't dictate the construction schedule.
That is a perfect way to put it. And as you repeat this process day after day, the architecture cures like concrete.
It sets.
It sets. The friction begins to drop. The activation energy required to sit down at 7:04 a.m. plummets because the action is no longer this massive conscious decision.
It's an automatic structural routine.
Exactly. By relying entirely on the discipline protocol, you've built a machine that processes dense, intimidating information 5 pages at a time. And it completely insulates your progress from the unreliability of your own moods.
And it ensures you never fall victim to information overload either.
Right.
You are never paralyzed by the sheer volume of the stack because the architecture carries the weight. You aren't trying to lift the entire project with a burst of temporary enthusiasm. You're just maintaining the structure.
And that is the profound shift in perspective the source offers. When you finally accept the incompatibility of these two forces, when you recognize the danger of the versus part, you stop wasting time trying to manipulate your feelings.
Yeah.
You stop waiting for that cinematic lightning strike of passion to hit before you do your work. You recognize that consistency is not a product of how you feel. It is a product of what you've built.
Which brings us to the core takeaway from this incredibly focused source material. True, meaningful action, the kind that allows you to actually master a new field or push through a difficult project or consistently expand your knowledge, it cannot be built on the shifting foundation of motivation.
It really can't.
It requires a fundamental rewiring of your behavioral hierarchy. You have to consciously lower the activation energy of your goals by building an architecture of action. And you construct that architecture by definitively and permanently prioritizing discipline over motivation.
That's the shortcut. The shortcut to actually achieving your objectives is realizing that you do not need to feel good to move forward.
Wow.
You just need the structure to support the movement. The architecture removes the anxiety of having to constantly generate your own enthusiasm. It frees you to simply execute the blueprint.
For you listening, this is an incredibly clarifying lens to apply to whatever challenge you're facing right now. Think about the friction you are experiencing with your current goals.
Ask yourself why you're stuck.
Exactly. Are you stuck because you lack information? Or are you stuck because you're relying on a protocol of motivation that is constantly calling in sick? If you shift the hierarchy, you completely change the outcome.
You stop negotiating with the resistance, and you start relying on the load-bearing walls you've put in place.
It is a phenomenal framework. But as we wrap up this deep dive into the architecture of action, I'm going to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Okay.
It's something that takes the mechanics of this source material and just pushes them one step further into the unknown.
I'm intrigued.
Well, we've established that discipline is the necessary architecture of action, right? We know how to build it, and we know why it must supersede motivation.
Right.
But if we accept that premise, what exactly is the architecture of discipline itself?
Oh, wow. That is the ultimate question of sustainability, isn't it? How is that foundational stone actually forged over the long term?
Exactly. Because think about the mechanics of habituation we just discussed. If you practice this kind of rigid structural discipline long enough, if you actively choose the discipline protocol over the motivation protocol day after day, year after year, what happens to the system?
The whole system adapts.
But does the friction eventually drop all the way to zero? Does the discipline become so deeply ingrained in your neural pathways, so automatic, that it actually transforms into a completely new, permanent kind of drive?
It is a fascinating paradox to consider. Does the absolute rejection of emotional motivation ultimately forge a much deeper structural form of it?
Does the cold stone eventually generate its own heat?
Wow.
It's something for you to ponder as you look at the goals sitting on your desk today. Because at the end of the day, if you want a structure to last, you have to dig down to the bedrock. Stop trying to build your most important actions on the shifting weather of how you feel and start laying the steel. That's our deep dive for today. Go build something permanent.